On one of the coldest nights Chicago had seen in years, billionaire Richard Caldwell stepped out of the back seat of his black limousine after a charity gala. The cameras had stopped flashing. The applause was over. Another $1 million donation had earned him another newspaper headline, but none of it made him feel less alone. At 63 years old, Richard owned luxury hotels, private jets, and more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. Yet every evening he returned to a mansion, so silent he could hear the grandfather clock echo through empty hallways. His wife Emily had died from cancer 15 years earlier. Their only daughter, Lily, had passed away at age 8 after a tragic car accident. Since then, Richard had buried himself in work. As he walked toward his waiting car, something caught his attention. A little girl, no, older than 7, was kneeling beside a homeless veteran under the bridge near the hotel. She carefully split a stale sandwich into 3 uneven pieces. The smallest piece she kept for herself. The biggest she quietly handed to the old man. Richard frowned. She hadn't noticed him watching. Eat, she whispered. The veteran shook his head. You need it more. She smiled. I'm little. I don't need much. Richard felt something tighten inside his chest. He crossed the street. The girl immediately stepped in front of the old man. Please don't make us leave, she said. Her voice didn't shake. She had clearly said those words many times before. Richard knelt. I'm not here to chase you away. She studied his expensive suit with suspicious blue eyes. What do you want? He didn't know how to answer. Instead, he asked, What's your name? Sophie. Where are your parents? Silence. Then, my mom died. And my dad. She looked away. He left before I could remember him. Richard swallowed hard. Who takes care of you? She shrugged. I take care of me. Those 6 words hit harder than any business negotiation he'd ever faced. A police officer nearby recognized her. Oh, that's Sophie. You know her. The officer sighed. She's been living around here for almost a year. We've tried placing her in foster care. She keeps running away. Richard looked confused. Why? The officer lowered his voice. Some homes weren't kind. Richard didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. Sophie's frightened eyes answered every question. Just then, snow began falling. Sophie gently covered the sleeping veteran with her own torn blanket. Richard stared. That's your blanket. She nodded. He gets colder than me. Richard had spent millions on charity dinners. Yet this little girl who owned almost nothing had just shown him what generosity truly looked like. For reasons he couldn't explain, he asked, Would you like something warm to eat? She hesitated. Can he come too? Richard smiled for the first time in months. Yes. An hour later, the 3 of them sat inside a quiet diner. Sophie stared at pancakes as though they were treasure. Before taking a single bite, she wrapped half of them in napkins. Richard laughed softly. For later, she shook her head. For Mrs. Jenkins. Who's Mrs. Jenkins? The old lady who sleeps near the train station. Richard blinked. You know a lot of homeless people. They're my neighbors. That sentence stayed with him forever. As they finished dinner, social services arrived. The caseworker gently reached for Sophie's hand. Come on, sweetheart. Sophie's smile disappeared. No. You need somewhere safe. I don't want another home. Richard interrupted. What if... Everyone looked at him. What if she came with me? The room fell silent. The caseworker blinked. Mr. Caldwell, you've never met this child. Richard looked directly at Sophie. I know, but I think... He paused. I've been waiting to meet her my whole life. Sophie stared at him with confused eyes. Would I have to leave if I spilled juice? Richard's heart nearly broke. No. What if I get sick? I'll take care of you. What if I have nightmares? I'll sit beside you until they stop. Her lip trembled. What if... She whispered the last question. You stop loving me? Richard couldn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his wallet. Inside was an old faded photo of his daughter Lily. He looked at it for a long moment, then closed the wallet forever. I already know what it feels like to lose someone I love. I would never choose to lose you. For the first time in years, Sophie cried. Not loud. Not dramatically. Just silent tears rolling down a little girl's dirty face. She slowly reached out and took his hand. That simple gesture changed both of their lives forever. Neither of them could possibly imagine that 20 years later, the homeless little girl he chose to love would stand before the entire world and do something that would leave millions in tears. The first night Sophie entered Richard Caldwell's mansion, she stood frozen in the front hallway. Marble floors stretched beneath her worn sneakers. A crystal chandelier sparkled overhead. Paintings lined the walls. Everything looked too perfect to touch. She quietly slipped off her shoes. Richard noticed. "You can keep them on." She shook her head. "I don't want to make the floor dirty." He looked at the spotless marble, then at the little girl whose socks had holes in them. For a moment he couldn't speak. Instead, he knelt beside her. "This is your home now," Sophie whispered. "Are you sure?" Richard smiled. "I'm sure." She nodded politely, but deep down she didn't believe him. She had heard promises before. They never lasted. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the housekeeper who had worked for Richard's family for over 30 years, welcomed Sophie with warm cookies and a soft blanket. "You must be hungry." Sophie accepted one cookie, then quietly tucked another into her pocket. Eleanor smiled. "Saving it?" Sophie looked embarrassed. "I'm just used to saving food." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "There will always be enough here." Sophie gave a tiny nod, but she still hid the cookie. Old habits don't disappear overnight. Richard showed her a beautiful bedroom painted in soft blue, with shelves full of books and a large stuffed teddy bear sitting on the bed. Sophie stood in the doorway. "This room," she hesitated. "Is it really mine?" "Every bit of it." She slowly walked inside, touching the blankets with the tips of her fingers. "They're so clean." Then she looked at the bed. "I've never had one this big." Richard waited for her to smile. Instead, she crawled underneath it. Richard blinked. "Sophie?" A quiet voice answered. "I'll sleep down here." "Why?" She looked away. "If someone gets mad at me, they'll have a harder time dragging me out." Richard felt as if someone had punched him in the chest. He sat on the floor beside the bed. "No one is going to drag you anywhere." She didn't answer. So Richard stayed there. An hour passed. Then another. Finally, Sophie crawled out and climbed onto the mattress. She fell asleep almost immediately. But only 20 minutes later, a scream echoed through the house. Richard rushed into her room. Sophie was sitting upright, shaking violently. "Please don't leave me." She wasn't awake. She was trapped in a nightmare. Without thinking, Richard gently sat beside her and held her small hand. "It's okay. You're safe." "I'm here." Slowly, her breathing calmed. Still half asleep, she whispered one heartbreaking sentence. "Mom." Richard closed his eyes. "I know." From that night on, whenever Sophie had nightmares, he sat beside her until morning. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. The next week, Richard took Sophie shopping. She had never been inside a luxury department store. A saleswoman smiled warmly. "What would you like to try first?" Sophie pointed toward the clearance rack. Richard laughed softly. "You can choose anything." She looked confused. "Anything?" "Anything." She walked past expensive dresses, past designer shoes, past sparkling jewelry. Finally, she picked 3 plain sweaters. "They're enough." Richard asked, "What about toys?" She shrugged. "I've never really had time to play." The words broke everyone's heart. Richard quietly bought the entire toy section anyway. When the truck delivered everything to the mansion, Sophie looked overwhelmed. "There are too many." "So? Other kids don't have any." Richard smiled. "What do you think we should do?" Her answer came instantly. "Can we give most of them away?" Richard stared at her. A little girl who had owned almost nothing still thought about children with even less. That evening, they loaded hundreds of toys into his SUV and delivered them to a children's shelter. One little boy hugged a teddy bear and refused to let go. Sophie watched from across the room. She smiled wider than she ever had receiving gifts herself. Richard realized something important. He hadn't rescued Sophie. She was quietly rescuing him. A few months later, the adoption became official. The courtroom was filled with smiles. The judge looked at Sophie. "Do you understand what today means?" She nodded. "It means I have a dad." The judge smiled. "And Richard, do you promise to love and protect Sophie as your daughter for the rest of your life?" Richard answered without hesitation. "I already have." The judge signed the papers. "It's official." Richard Caldwell was now Sophie's father. As they walked out of the courthouse, reporters crowded around them. One shouted, "Mr. Caldwell, why adopt a homeless child when you could have donated more money instead?" Richard stopped walking. He looked down at Sophie, who was holding his hand tightly. Then he answered with quiet conviction. "Money can build shelters. It can buy food. It can change lives. But every child deserves something money alone can never buy. A family." The cameras captured Sophie's smile. No one watching the evening news realized that this little girl, once forgotten beneath a bridge, would one day grow into a woman whose final gift to her father would move an entire nation to tears. The years passed more quickly than either of them expected. By the time Sophie turned 9, the frightened little girl who once hid food in her pockets had begun to laugh, without looking over her shoulder. The mansion no longer felt like a museum. It finally sounded like a home. Her laughter echoed through the hallways. Coloring books covered the dining table. Her shoes were always left by the front door. For the first time since Emily and Lily had died, Richard no longer dreaded coming home after work. He found himself leaving the office earlier every evening. Business meetings became shorter. Bedtime stories became longer. His board of directors noticed the change. "You've canceled 3 international trips this month," one executive complained. Richard smiled. "My daughter has a school play." The room fell silent. No one argued. One Saturday morning, Richard decided to surprise Sophie. "Get your coat." She looked up from her homework. "Where are we going?" "It's a surprise." An hour later, they arrived at the city's largest amusement park. Children ran past carrying balloons. Music filled the air. Sophie's eyes grew wide. "Is this for me?" Richard nodded. She didn't run toward the rides. Instead, she stared at the entrance. "What is it?" Richard asked. She pointed toward a little boy outside the gate. He was selling flowers with his younger sister beside him. Neither of them had tickets. Sophie quietly walked over. "Have you ever been inside?" The boy shook his head. "We're working." Without saying a word, Sophie returned to Richard. "Can they come with us?" Richard smiled. "Of course." By the end of the day, not only had those 2 children joined them, Richard had quietly bought tickets for 12 more children from the nearby shelter. Watching them laugh together became his favorite part of the day. On the drive home, Sophie rested her head against the window. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Today was the happiest day of my life." Richard smiled. "Mine too." At school, however, not everything was easy. Some classmates whispered behind Sophie's back. "She's not his real daughter. She used to be homeless. She probably only got adopted because he's rich." Sophie ignored them for weeks. Then one afternoon, Richard received a phone call from the principal. There was an incident. He hurried to the school. Instead of finding Sophie crying, he found her sitting beside another girl. The girl had been the one bullying her. She was crying. Richard looked confused. The principal explained. "Emily Parker lost control after learning her parents are getting divorced. She said terrible things to Sophie." Richard looked at Sophie. "What happened then?" Sophie shrugged. "I remembered how lonely I used to feel. So I hugged her." Richard blinked. "You hugged her?" She looked like she needed one. Even Emily looked surprised. "I said awful things to you." Sophie smiled gently. "I know, but hurting people usually have something hurting them first." Richard had spent decades studying business strategy. Yet his 10-year-old daughter understood people better than most adults ever would. That Christmas, Sophie asked Richard for only one gift. "What would you like?" She handed him a folded piece of paper. He opened it. Instead of toys, instead of electronics, instead of expensive clothes, the page contained only one sentence. "Can we invite people who don't have families to spend Christmas with us?" Richard stared at the note for a long time. Then he smiled. I think we can do better than that. 3 weeks later, the Caldwell mansion was transformed. More than 200 foster children, veterans, widows, single parents, and homeless families filled every room with laughter. Professional chefs prepared dinner. Musicians volunteered their time. Every child received gifts. Richard stood quietly in the corner watching it all. None of this had been his idea. It had been Sophie's. Mrs. Brooks walked beside him. She reminds me of someone. Who? Lily. Richard looked toward the ceiling for a moment. I think Lily would have loved her. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Sophie found Richard sitting alone beside the fireplace. You missed them tonight. He looked surprised. My wife and daughter. Richard nodded slowly. Sometimes. Sophie climbed onto the chair beside him. You know, I never got to meet them. No. But she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small drawing. It showed 4 people standing together beneath a bright sun. Richard, Emily, Lily, and Sophie. At the top, she had written, Families don't always begin together, but love makes them whole. Richard's eyes filled with tears. He carefully folded the drawing and placed it inside his wallet. It replaced the old photograph he had carried for years, not because he had forgotten Emily and Lily, but because they had finally led him back to life. That night, as Sophie hugged him goodnight, Richard whispered something he had never said aloud before. You didn't just become my daughter. You saved your father's heart. Sophie smiled. And you gave me one to come home to. Neither of them knew that in just a few years, a tragedy would test that promise in ways neither could imagine. By the time Sophie turned 16, she had grown into a bright, compassionate young woman whose kindness seemed to touch everyone she met. Teachers admired her. Neighbors adored her. Employees at Caldwell Industries smiled whenever she visited the office. Unlike many children raised in extraordinary wealth, Sophie never acted as though she was above anyone. She still remembered where she had come from. Every Friday after school, she volunteered at the same homeless shelter where Richard had first taken her years earlier. She never told anyone she was the daughter of one of America's richest men. To the families there, she was simply Miss Sophie. One snowy evening, Richard stopped by the shelter to surprise her. He found Sophie sitting on the floor, reading a storybook to a group of children. One little boy interrupted. Miss Sophie, were you ever homeless? The room became quiet. Richard waited to hear her answer. She smiled gently. Yes. The children stared in disbelief. But you're rich. She shook her head. My dad is rich. I was rich long before that. The boy frowned. How? She placed her hand over her heart. Because someone chose to love me. Richard quietly stepped back into the hallway. His eyes filled with tears. She had never measured wealth by money, only by love. A few months later, Richard collapsed during an important board meeting. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Doctors ran every test they could. When Sophie reached the hospital, she found Richard sitting silently beside the window. What did they say? He forced a smile. They found something with my heart. The smile disappeared from Sophie's face. Is it serious? Richard hesitated. The doctors think I need surgery. Sophie grabbed his hand. When? As soon as possible. For the first time since he had adopted her. Their roles quietly changed. Instead of Richard comforting Sophie, Sophie became the one offering strength. Every morning before school, she visited the hospital. Every evening, she read his favorite novels aloud until he fell asleep. One night, Richard woke to find Sophie asleep in the chair beside his bed, still holding his hand. A nurse whispered, She's been here every single day. Richard smiled weakly. I know. The surgery was successful, but recovery was slow. Richard could no longer work 16-hour days. His doctors warned him that stress could shorten his life. The board of directors began pushing him toward retirement. Some executives even questioned whether Sophie should inherit the company one day. She's too emotional. Business requires tough decisions. Richard listened quietly. Then he stood. You think kindness is weakness? He looked around the boardroom. It's the greatest strength I've ever witnessed. No one argued. That summer, Sophie graduated from high school as valedictorian. Her speech wasn't about grades. It wasn't about success. She looked at hundreds of families gathered in the auditorium and said, "When I was little, I believed being invisible was the safest way to live." Then one man looked at me and truly saw me. If you remember only one thing today, notice the people everyone else walks past. One moment of kindness can rewrite someone's entire future. The audience rose to its feet. Even people who had never met her were wiping away tears. Richard stood in the back of the auditorium, applauding harder than anyone. He had never been prouder. That evening, they celebrated quietly on the back porch of the mansion. The sun was setting. The sky glowed orange and gold. Richard handed Sophie a small velvet box. Inside was a silver compass. Confused, she looked up. "What is this?" "It belonged to my father." He smiled. "He always told me, when you know your purpose, you'll never lose your way." He gently closed her hand around it. "I think it belongs to you now." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I'll treasure it forever." Then she reached into her backpack. "I have something for you too." It was a simple framed photograph. Not of a mansion. Not of an expensive vacation. It was the first picture ever taken of them together, in that little diner 20 years earlier. On the back she had written, "The day two lonely hearts found a family." Richard hugged her tightly. "I love you, Sophie." She smiled through her tears. "I love you too, Dad." Neither of them realized that within a few years, Sophie would make a decision so extraordinary. It would forever change her father's legacy and leave an entire nation in tears. The summer after graduation, Sophie received acceptance letters from some of the most prestigious universities in America. Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia. Richard proudly spread them across the dining room table. "I don't care which one you choose," he said with a smile. "I'll support you no matter what." Sophie looked at the letters for a long time. Then she quietly pushed them aside. Richard noticed. "What's wrong?" She took a deep breath. "Dad, I don't want to spend my life making money." Richard chuckled. "That's probably the first time anyone in this family has ever said that." She smiled. "I want to spend my life changing lives." A few weeks later, Sophie shared an idea she had been carrying in her heart for years. What if no child ever had to sleep under a bridge again? Richard looked at her. "I'm listening. I don't just want to build shelters. I want to build places that feel like homes. Somewhere children are loved, educated, and given a real chance." Richard remained silent. Not because he disagreed, but because he saw the same determination in her eyes that Emily had once carried. He nodded. "Then let's build it." Construction began the following spring. Instead of another luxury hotel, Richard purchased 50 acres of land just outside Chicago. Architects expected Sophie to request grand buildings with impressive entrances. Instead, she surprised everyone. "No giant gates, no cold walls. I want front porches, gardens, playgrounds, a library, a music room, and every child gets their own bedroom." One architect asked, "Wouldn't shared rooms save money?" Sophie answered softly, "A child who's never had anything deserves one place in the world that's truly theirs." No one questioned her again. As the project grew, news stations began covering it. People called it the Second Chance Village. Donations poured in from across the country. Teachers volunteered. Doctors offered free medical care. Retired couples signed up as mentors. Thousands wanted to help. But Sophie insisted on one rule. No child will ever be treated like a charity case. They'll be treated like family. One afternoon, while touring the construction site, Sophie noticed a familiar face. An elderly man was quietly sweeping the sidewalk nearby. She stopped walking. It was the homeless veteran she had shared a sandwich with 20 years earlier. His beard had turned completely white. His hands shook with age. But his kind eyes hadn't changed. "Mr. Thomas?" The old man looked up. For a moment, he didn't recognize the elegant young woman standing before him. Then she smiled. "I used to steal half my sandwich for you." His eyes widened. "Little Sophie?" Before another word could be spoken, she wrapped her arms around him. Workers nearby stopped what they were doing. Many were wiping away tears. Richard walked over, smiling. "I've been looking for you for years," he told Mr. Thomas. The old veteran lowered his head. "I didn't think anyone remembered an old man like me." Sophie gently squeezed his hand. "I never forgot the people who helped me survive." Instead of offering him money, Sophie offered something else. A home. She invited Mr. Thomas to become the first resident mentor at Second Chance Village. His job wasn't to clean or cook. His job was simply to listen to children who felt alone. He accepted with tears in his eyes. "I've spent my whole life believing I had nothing left to give." Sophie smiled. "You've always had hope to give." Months later, Second Chance Village officially opened. Hundreds gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Politicians gave speeches. Television cameras rolled. Richard was asked to speak first. He walked to the podium but surprised everyone. "This isn't my dream." He turned toward Sophie. "It never was." He stepped away from the microphone. The crowd erupted into applause as Sophie approached. Looking out over the children playing on brand-new swings, she smiled. "When I was 7 years old, I believed the world had forgotten me. One man proved me wrong. If one person can change one child's life, imagine what thousands of us can do together." The audience stood in a thunderous standing ovation. Richard watched from the front row, his eyes shining with pride. He whispered to himself, "Your mother would be so proud of you." But that night, after the celebration ended, Richard quietly experienced a sharp pain in his chest. He dismissed it as exhaustion. He didn't tell Sophie. He didn't want to worry her. He had no idea. It was the first warning of the illness that would soon change both of their lives forever. The months following the opening of Second Chance Village were the happiest Richard had experienced in decades. Children filled the village with laughter. Families who had once felt hopeless were finding new beginnings. And every time Richard watched Sophie walking hand in hand with a frightened child, he silently thanked God for the day they had met under that bridge. But the pain in his chest kept returning. At first, he ignored it. Then he began canceling meetings. Soon, even climbing a flight of stairs left him exhausted. One morning, while Sophie was speaking at a fundraising event in New York, Richard quietly visited his cardiologist alone. After several hours of testing, the doctor entered the room with a heavy expression. "I'm afraid the surgery bought you time, but your heart has continued to weaken." Richard looked out the window. "How much time?" The doctor hesitated. "If we're fortunate, a year." The words settled over the room like a heavy fog. Richard nodded calmly. "Don't tell my daughter." For several weeks, he kept his promise. Whenever Sophie asked how he was feeling, he smiled. "I'm just getting older." But fathers can hide pain only for so long. One evening, Richard fainted while walking through the gardens at Second Chance Village. Mr. Thomas was the first to reach him. The ambulance arrived within minutes. When Sophie rushed into the hospital, she found doctors surrounding Richard's bed. She looked at the physician with frightened eyes. "Tell me the truth." The doctor lowered his voice. "He wanted to protect you, but his condition is serious." Sophie slowly turned toward her father. "You knew?" Richard couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry." Tears streamed down Sophie's face. "You promised we'd face everything together." He reached for her trembling hand. "I didn't want your life to become filled with fear." She squeezed his hand tightly. "My life became better because of you. Don't ever decide for me how much of your pain I can carry." Richard broke down. For the first time since Emily's death, he cried openly. Richard returned home a week later. He could no longer run Caldwell Industries. After much thought, he announced his retirement. The news shocked Wall Street. Reporters filled the front gates of the mansion. Business analysts wondered who would inherit the company. Many assumed Sophie would become the new CEO. Instead, during the press conference, she surprised everyone. "I won't be leading Caldwell Industries." The room erupted with questions. "Why not?" She smiled gently. "Because my father taught me that success isn't measured by how much you own. It's measured by how many lives you lift." She announced that experienced executives would manage the company while she dedicated herself full-time to Second Chance Village. Some investors criticized her decision. Others called it foolish. Richard simply smiled. He had never been prouder. That Christmas, Richard was too weak to host the enormous celebration they had held for years. So Sophie brought Christmas to him. She invited every child from Second Chance Village to the mansion. The grand ballroom was transformed into a winter wonderland. Children decorated cookies with Mrs. Brooks. Mr. Thomas played Santa, Klaus with a long white beard that hardly needed any extra cotton. Laughter echoed through every hallway. Richard watched from his favorite chair by the fireplace. A little girl climbed onto his lap. "Mr. Caldwell?" "Yes, sweetheart?" "Miss Sophie says you saved her." Richard smiled softly. "No. I simply opened a door." She walked through it, and then held it open for everyone else. Across the room, Sophie overheard those words. She quietly wiped away a tear. Late that night, after the children had gone home, Richard called Sophie into his study. The room was dimly lit. On his desk sat a thick envelope. "I've been working on something." He handed it to her. Inside were legal papers. She looked confused. "What is this?" "I've rewritten my will." Sophie's face fell. "Dad," he gently interrupted. "Listen to me. When I found you, I thought I was rescuing a little girl. But you rescued an old man who had forgotten how to live." He placed his hand over hers. "I've left you my greatest treasure." She looked around the room. "The company?" He smiled and shook his head. "No. You. You reminded me that love grows every time it's shared." Sophie's tears fell onto the papers. She wrapped her arms around him and whispered, "You'll always be my greatest gift." Richard held her close, knowing there was one final surprise he still hoped to give her, a surprise he had been planning quietly for years. It would be revealed after he was gone, and it would leave not only Sophie, but an entire nation in tears. Spring arrived, but Richard's strength continued to fade. He no longer walked through the gardens without assistance. The children at Second Chance Village noticed. Whenever he visited, they rushed to his wheelchair instead of waiting for him to come to them. They called him Grandpa Richard. He loved every second of it. One afternoon, Sophie wheeled him to the small bridge overlooking the village pond. The trees were covered in fresh blossoms. Children's laughter floated through the air. Richard smiled. "Do you hear that?" Sophie nodded. "The kids?" He shook his head. "Hope?" For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard reached into his coat pocket and handed Sophie a small brass key. She frowned. "What's this for?" "Promise me. You won't use it until my lawyer tells you." Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't want keys. I want more time." Richard gently squeezed her hand. "So do I." A few weeks later, Richard asked to spend one final afternoon in downtown Chicago. Instead of visiting his office, instead of seeing one of his hotels, he asked the driver to stop beneath the old bridge where he had first met Sophie 20 years earlier. The place looked different now. The tents were gone. The city had cleaned the area. But Richard recognized the spot immediately. He looked at Sophie. "Do you remember?" She smiled through tears. "I remember sharing one sandwich." Richard laughed softly. "And you gave away the biggest piece." She shrugged. He was hungrier. Richard looked at her with pride. "You've never stopped doing that." They sat together in silence. Just before leaving, Sophie slipped a fresh bouquet of white lilies beneath the bridge. "For the little girl who survived here," she whispered. Richard quietly replied, "And for the man who found his family here." 3 days later, Richard Caldwell passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 79 years old. The news spread across America within hours. Television stations interrupted their programming. Business leaders praised his success. Politicians honored his generosity. But the stories people shared most weren't about his fortune. They were about the little homeless girl he had chosen to love. Thousands gathered outside Second Chance Village. Children left handwritten notes. Flowers covered the entrance. Candles lit the sidewalks for blocks. At the funeral, more than 2,000 people filled the church. CEOs sat beside homeless veterans. Governors sat beside foster children. No one cared about titles that day. They had all come for the same reason: to say goodbye. When Sophie stepped to the podium, the room became completely silent. She unfolded a small piece of paper, then smiled. "I'm not going to read a speech. I'm going to tell you who my father really was. She took a slow breath. When I met him, I owned one torn blanket. He owned almost everything. But somehow, I was the one who gave him the greatest gift. She looked toward Richard's casket. The chance to become a father again. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. After the service, Richard's attorney approached Sophie. It's time. He handed her the envelope Richard had mentioned months earlier. Inside was a handwritten letter, and a note that simply read, "Use the key." With trembling hands, Sophie unlocked a small wooden chest that had been waiting in Richard's study. Inside were hundreds of letters. Every birthday, every Christmas, every graduation, every future milestone. Richard had written letters for moments he knew he might never live to see. There was one marked, "The day you become a mother." Another, "When you feel like giving up." Another, "For your 50th birthday." Sophie collapsed into tears. But there was one final envelope at the bottom. It was labeled, "Open this in front of everyone." She looked at the attorney. He nodded. Richard had left one last surprise. A surprise so extraordinary that it would soon bring an entire nation to tears. A week after Richard Caldwell's funeral, more than 5,000 people gathered at Second Chance Village. News crews from across America stood shoulder to shoulder. No one knew why Richard's final letter had instructed Sophie to open the last envelope in public. On the stage stood only three things: a wooden podium, Richard's framed photograph, the small envelope marked, "Open this in front of everyone." Sophie took a deep breath. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. She recognized her father's elegant handwriting immediately. Her voice shook as she began to read. "My dearest Sophie, if you're reading this, then my journey on Earth has ended. Don't cry for too long. I lived a life fuller than I ever imagined because of you. People will remember me as a businessman. Some will remember me as a millionaire. A few may remember my charity work. But if I could choose how history remembers me, I would choose only one title: Sophie's dad." The audience smiled through tears. She continued reading. 20 years ago, I thought I found a homeless little girl beneath a bridge. The truth is, I found the person who would save my soul. You taught me that love isn't measured by what we keep. It's measured by what we're willing to give away." Sophie had to pause. The tears made it difficult to see the page. Thousands in the crowd quietly wiped away their own tears. She turned to the final page. "There was one last request. Now I have one final favor to ask. Don't let Second Chance Village end with us. Build one in every state. No child should ever wonder if they're worth loving. And I've made sure you'll have everything you need." Confused, Sophie looked toward the attorney. He smiled gently. "Keep reading." At the bottom of the letter was one final sentence. "I have donated 95% of my personal fortune to the Richard and Sophie Caldwell Foundation." A gasp swept through the crowd. The attorney stepped forward. "Mr. Caldwell left over $8 billion to create homes, schools, scholarships, counseling centers, and family support programs across America." The reporters lowered their cameras. Many were crying too. Sophie stood frozen. She whispered, "He gave it all away." The attorney smiled. "He said he already owned everything he ever wanted." "He had you." The audience rose to its feet. The applause lasted nearly 10 minutes. Not because of the money, but because everyone understood what Richard had truly left behind. Hope. Over the next decade, Second Chance Villages opened across the United States. Thousands of children found safe homes. Former foster children became teachers. Homeless veterans became mentors. Families were reunited. Lives were rebuilt. Above the entrance of every village hung the same simple sign: "Every child deserves someone who chooses them." Beneath it appeared two names: Richard Caldwell. Sophie Caldwell. 20 years after Richard's passing, Sophie returned alone to the bridge where they had first met. She carried no cameras, no reporters, only a single white lily. She placed it gently on the ground and smiled. Nearby, she noticed a frightened little boy sitting alone with a backpack that looked far too small to hold a whole life. She slowly walked over and knelt beside him. "Hi." The boy looked nervous. "Are you going to tell me to leave?" Sophie smiled. "No." "What's your name?" Ethan. She held out her hand. I'm Sophie. He looked at her uncertainly. What do you want? Her eyes filled with tears as she remembered asking the exact same question, 20 years earlier. She smiled the same warm smile Richard had once given her. I was wondering, would you like something warm to eat? The little boy nodded. She took his hand, and together they walked toward a brighter future. Epilogue. People often said Richard Caldwell changed one little girl's life. They were wrong. One little girl changed his. And because they found each other on one freezing winter night beneath a bridge, millions of lives were forever changed.